Hey everyone, welcome to Activate Your Classroom. I'm your host, Glenn Wagner. I think if there's one thing that teachers do in probably most classrooms throughout the planet is to ask their students questions during a lesson. Here's a few teachers talking about why they question their students during their lessons.
Okay, Mara, why do you ask questions in the classroom?
Well, the most common reason is, of course, checking for understanding, seeing if my students are following what I'm explaining. But then the other way that I like to ask questions is to get them confused about what they think they know and to push them to come up with better answers to previous questions.
To make them think, to find out what they know, to find out what they know that is wrong and I need to tackle it.
I think for me it really comes down to just engaging the students in the topic that we're going to be studying. So getting them a chance to think about that and then hopefully get excited to learn more about it.
Now, the research shows that teachers do most of the question asking in the classroom. Some studies show up to 80% of all the questions asked in the classroom is from the teacher. Now, how you frame those questions, in other words, how you deliver them to the students, is going to have a huge impact on the amount of participation that you're going to see in your classroom. In this video, I'm going to show you 4 steps that you can take that will allow all students in your classroom to engage with the questions that you ask them, and not just those 2 or 3 really keen students that love to participate. Let me show you how it's done. All right, we're going to do a little bit of role play now. I'm going to ask a fictitious class a question on weather and climate. It's going to be a simple question. And I want you to watch how I frame the question. And the question might look something like this. Okay, class, yesterday we learned the differences between weather and climate. John, what are the differences between weather and climate, please? Now that is a perfectly reasonable question to ask the students. It's based on the work from the previous day, and arguably the kids should know it. But if you notice how I framed the question, I've chosen exactly 1 student to engage with that question, leaving the rest of the students unengaged. How do we fix it? Well, let me show you those 4 steps that we need to do in order to get all of the students engaging with the questions you ask in the classroom.
All right, so go and ask your questions, but as you do so, think about the level of thinking that those questions you're going to ask are going to elicit in the minds of the students, because this is ultimately going to affect the amount of wait time that you want to give the kids in order to engage with the question and to formulate an answer. More on wait time in a moment. In order to gauge that level of thinking, you might want to use Bloom's taxonomy as that lens through which the students are going to engage with your questions. So for example, are your questions of the understanding and remembering sort, a little bit lower level? Or are they applying, analyzing, or even creating something new? If that's the case, then again, you have to think about the amount of time that you give the students to be able to engage with those questions. Finally, consider the type of language that you use when you frame the questions. So in our previous question, we said, what are the differences between weather and climate? Well, you could soften that a little bit and say something like, what are some of the differences between weather and climate? Now, this matters because perhaps not all the students remember everything about weather and climate from the previous lesson. And so this allows, many of the students to remember a few things and to be able to volunteer an answer so that they can also participate and engage with your questions. The wait time between when a question is asked and when you wait for an answer is critically important in creating an engaging learning environment in your classroom. The general rule simply is this, that the greater the amount of thinking, the higher the level of the thinking, the greater the wait time you need to give to the kids. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to participate. They're not going to be feeling safe to do so. So how much wait time? Well, researchers who've looked at question asking in the classroom have found that when teachers give their students anywhere between 3 and 5 seconds or longer to absorb the question and then formulate an answer, they noticed that 3 fantastic things started happening. First, they found that not only did the length of the answers increase, but the correctness increased as well. Next, the number of I don't knows dropped off dramatically. Finally, researchers noticed that the number of volunteers to answer those questions increased dramatically. And this is exactly what you're looking for to create that engaging learning environment that you so want for your classroom. Finally, something that you perhaps don't see in your classroom, and that is that psychological safety that you give the students when you extend that wait time to answer the question. It gives them a chance to think, a chance to formulate answers in their own mind. And that, again, gives students that feeling that they've got time to process, because we all know that students take different amounts of time to process a question and come up with an answer. So give them that extra time so that they can all participate in your classroom. Now let's go back and reframe that question previously, and to add in some wait time and also to soften the language just a little bit. The question might look something now like this. Okay, everyone, I want you to think back to yesterday's lesson on the differences between weather and climate that we learned. What I'd like you to do is to take about 10 seconds, and I want you to try and remember what some of those differences were. And then I'm going to pick 2 or 3 of you to share your answers, so be ready because I might pick you. You ready? Go. Sharing privately is probably the most powerful thing that you can do when framing questions in your classroom. So what does this mean? Well, once you've delivered the question, once you've given the students the appropriate wait time, have them turn to a peer, have them turn to a partner and explain their answer. And in this way, you can get every single student engaged with your question. They're talking about it, they're interacting with each other around it, which is exactly what you want for an engaged classroom. Now, sharing privately does 3 very important things for the student. First, the student can test their understanding of both the question and the answer before they have an opportunity to share publicly. Next, the students can then correct their misunderstandings or misinterpretations of the question. And this way, they can come to an agreement, hopefully, surrounding the answer to your questions. Finally, as I always tell my students, if you can explain it, you understand it, which means that you feel confident enough in your answer to be able to turn to a partner, a peer, or even a complete stranger and to be able to explain your reasoning and feel very confident that you're correct. All right, now you have every right as a teacher to hold each student in your class accountable for their answers. You've given them the wait time, you've given them the opportunity to share privately and test their understanding. So go ahead, ask some students what their answers might be. Now, when you go and ask the question to a student, you can actually turn it into sort of a group answer, if you will. And you'd frame the question maybe a little something like this. Now, John and Jane, it looked like you two were having a good discussion around the differences between weather and climate. Jane, what were you and John remembering? Now, almost every time the student will say, "We thought that," and then they'll give their answer. And that provides that a little more emotional safety to answer in a public situation, so that if there is a problem, then the person can then lean on their partner to come in and give them a little bit of a hand. Now let's reframe that question one last time. That brings in wait time as well as the opportunity to share privately. And it's going to look something like this now. Yesterday we learned the differences between weather and climate. I want you to think back to yesterday's lesson. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds and I want you to think about what those differences were. All right, silently to yourself. Here we go. All right, turn to a partner and share your answers with each other and see if you can together come up with the correct answer. And then I'm going to pick 1 or 2 of you to share your answers with the entire class. Ready? Go. Okay, let's sum up. Begin your question asking by planning out the question, the level of thinking that the question is going to elicit in the minds of the students. Next, consider the wait time surrounding the complexity of your question. In this video, the question on weather and climate, pretty low level, probably didn't require a huge amount of wait time compared to higher end thinking, but make sure you provide that wait time. Very, very important. To me, the secret sauce to engaging your class around the questions you ask is giving them an opportunity to share privately. In this way, the stress is low before they share publicly. I rarely ask a question in my class without giving the kids an opportunity to share privately. Finally, hold the kids accountable for their learning. Get them to share publicly. Feel free to ask any kid in the classroom the answer to the question that you posed.
Okay, here's 2 sets of questions for you to look at. On the left side is the original question, and on the right side is the reframed question. Now, I think you'll see in the reframed questions, either wait time has been given or wait time plus sharing privately has been given before they share publicly. Pause the video and have a look and you can see the differences between the 2 questions now. All right, go back and reframe some questions in your classroom now so that you give the students wait time and you allow them to share privately before they share publicly. And I think you're going to see a highly engaged classroom, a lot of productive talk around the questions that you ask. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm your host, Glenn Wagner, for Activate Your Classroom. Please hit the subscribe button below. It gives me further encouragement to create videos in the future on how to make classrooms a more dynamic and interesting place for both teachers and students. Thank you again.